Hi, welcome everyone. First and foremost, I hope everyone is safe and well while we navigate this pandemic together. My name is Peter Hyun, and I'm a partner at Wiley, a Washington, D.C. law firm. I'm a board member of the Asian Pacific American Bar Association of the Greater Washington, D.C. area. For those of you joining us from around the country, APABA-DC is the oldest and largest association of AAPI lawyers, law students, law professors, recovering lawyers, all throughout the Washington, D.C. metro region. It's been around since 1981. It has a threefold mission to first, promote the professional growth of its members, second, cultivate an understanding of issues facing the APA community, and third, promote community involvement. Today, we are privileged to have Chris Liu joining us. You all should have received his bio, and I will go over it quickly. Chris is currently a senior strategy advisor at FiscalNote and senior fellow at the UVA Miller Center. He's also a political commentator and was the former Deputy Secretary of Labor under the Obama administration, where he was the Chief Operating Officer of the Labor Department, which has over 17,000 employees and a $12 billion budget. He also served as White House Cabinet Secretary prior to his service in the Labor Department. And in introducing him today, I also wanted to mention a couple of things. Chris, there were others who know you who heard that I was going to have this conversation with you today. And I asked them for three words to describe you, and I said that I would share it during this introduction. First, there is a former political appointee at Labor who worked with you closely, who described you as generous, as a colleague, mentor, and guide, sharp and witty, which he also underscored by saying, which everyone knows by now thanks to his media appearances and his Twitter. Another person who was a senior career leader at the Labor Department said that you were approachable, intelligent, and strategic. And in fact, a junior staffer who worked in then Senator Obama's Senate office while you were the legislative director described you as smart, serious, and fair. So it was no surprise to me that these folks sang your praises. Really looking forward to chatting today. Welcome.
It's great to be here, Peter. Thank you for having me, and I appreciate you doing your due diligence. And I'm now scratching my head as to who said those nice things. So
I will let you know. So a lot of people know about your professional accomplishments. Could you just give us some background on your upbringing and how it is that you ended up going to law school to begin with?
So I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. My family moved here when I was 8 years old from New Jersey. I am the son of Chinese immigrants and always had this incredible love of politics. And so one of my most formative experiences was interning for my hometown senator after my sophomore year of college. And so went to Princeton undergrad and, really wanted to, always had a dream of being involved somehow in politics, just wasn't quite sure what it was. I always joke that I was kind of a dopey liberal arts major and, wasn't smart enough to get a PhD. So I did what every other dopey liberal arts major does and comes to law school. And, I look, it was a perfectly fine experience. And obviously along the way, met some people who have helped me later in life. But I would love to tell you there was some great life plan that led me to the career in law, but there really wasn't.
Hmm. So fast forwarding then, because we have a lot of law students who have tuned in and who are interested in your story. When you were in law school and you begin your first year, what was sort of the mindset? What type of mental space were you in as a 1L? In other words, what were your aspirations, your goals?
Wow, I know I'm supposed to come up with something incredibly witty right here and insightful. Look, I made a lot of mistakes along the way. I went straight through from college to law school. I'm not sure I'd recommend that to most people. And so my thought process first year of law school was just, I'm horribly burnt out right now. Notwithstanding the fact that I'm meeting all these interesting people, I'm taking all of these classes. So the first thing I say to people, if you're thinking about law school, take some time off and make sure it's the right decision for you. In the end, it turned out to be a perfectly fine decision for me.
Mhm.
But I think I would have gotten a lot more out of the experience if I had taken some time off. And I think I would have probably chosen my courses better. I think I would have gotten more outside of the classroom. So, look, I don't know that anyone should necessarily emulate their career after mine.
Fair enough. So when you were, so then when you were in law school, take us back during that time, other than yourself, was there anyone in law school perhaps who you met while you were there, for whom you thought, wow, that person has the makings to become the president of the United States someday?
Yeah. So look, I would love to tell you, like I said, don't plan your life around mine. But I always tell people, if you want to go work in the White House someday, figure out who the president 20 or 30 years from now is, and then go to law school with that person. I had the privilege of being in the same law school class with a guy named Barack Obama, and but then again, we had some really remarkable people in our law school class, including Neil Gorsuch is one of my classmates as well.
Mm-hmm.
And because when your law school classmate becomes president, there are a large number of people who end up going into the administration. People who, like Norm Eisen and Julius Janikowski and Mike Froman and lots of other people who I had the privilege of serving with. But obviously, the most famous person in our law school class was Barack Obama, and then probably Neil Gorsuch after that.
Mm. So going back then, so you enter law school here, you go straight through. What what do you think was sort of your career ambition, if you had one at the time? In other words, and how did that develop?
Yeah, I would love to tell you I had any career ambition. If anything, my career is like a lesson in what you should not do. And make sure you understand why you're going to law school. And when you get there, have a little bit more of a plan than I had, which was just how can I get through this experience as easily as possible. I didn't take any clinicals. I didn't really like. I just was literally trying to rack up credits just to graduate. I had an ambition to be a prosecutor.
Hmm.
This was the late 80s, early 90s. This is the period of it's a period of Rudy Giuliani running the Southern District, which used to be kind of a big deal. It's not as actually a I don't use that analogy that much anymore. And I wanted to, I think, go into public service. But lo and behold, like everything else, I mean, if you graduate with law school debt, college debt, a lot of your career options narrow, and that was the case with me.
Hmm. So you mentioned, public service and also dating back to growing up and having this interest in politics. How is it that you ended up professionally going into public service?
Yeah. So after law school, I clerked for a federal court of appeals judge in New Jersey, which was an amazing experience. And the judge I clerked for, Robert Cowan on the Third Circuit, is still a mentor to me. Then I went to work at a law firm, Sidley Austin, here in Washington, D.C., and was a litigation associate for about 4.5 years. Then it's a wonderful law firm. I had a lot of great experiences, met a lot of interesting people, but it really was, I think it solidified for me that I really wanted to go into public service. So in 1997, I made my first jump, my only jump from the private sector to the public sector. Went to go work for a committee that people hadn't really focused that much on back in the day. It was the House Oversight Committee, and it's gotten a lot more attention in recent years. And joined the House Oversight Committee as a counsel doing investigations.
Hmm. And how did that decision or that opportunity come about? Was it something that you had heard about, or somebody had basically given you a call and said, "Hey, Chris"?
Yeah. I mean, look, I mean, I love that. Whenever I tell these stories, it makes it seem like I'm just very haphazardly going through my life. I think there's a lot of luck involved in this. And so, as I said, I went to law school with Barack Obama. So that obviously played a huge role in my career. When I went to work for the House Oversight Committee, the senior Democrat, the ranking member, was Henry Waxman from California, a longtime liberal giant. His chief of staff was a guy named Phil Shaliro, who ended up becoming a mentor to me as well. And Phil was the staff director. Phil, in addition to being a congressional staffer, had also run for Congress twice. One of his campaign managers was my best friend since the third grade. And, my best friend sort of put me in touch with Phil. And what I always tell people is, I mean, the goal when you're trying to look for a job is how do you get your resume from the big stack to the small stack that people are actually looking at? And when you have somebody you've known since the third grade, that can vouch for you. That makes all the difference in the world. And so when you sort of look at other aspects of my career, that same level of luck and connections has really been what I've counted on for a lot of my positions.
Now, you mentioned Phil and getting connected to him through this your best friend since the third grade. And
Yeah.
were there others sort of important people that you met during that time in your life? And could you describe those relationships and how they formed?
People always ask about how do I find a mentor, and
Hmm.
you don't pick a mentor. I mean, when I was at Sidley, they assigned me a mentor on day one. I think the guy took me out to lunch, and I'm not sure I ever saw him again. That's not the way mentorships work. I mean, you're not assigned to somebody. It really has to be based on years of working together, a common bond. Not necessarily, you don't necessarily need to be friends, but it needs to be somebody who trusts you and you trust them. And so later in my career, I spent 8 years on the House Oversight Committee. One day, Phil Scalero, again, my staff director, came to me in the fall of 2004 and said, "Hey, would you be interested in being the legislative director for Senator Hillary Clinton?" And I said, "Sure." So I went to go interview for that job. And while I was waiting for that job, Phil came back and said, "Hey, didn't you go to law school with Barack Obama?" And Obama had just gotten elected to the Senate. And Phil said, "Well, they're looking for a legislative director." And so I went to go interview for that job as well. At that time, Obama had chosen as his first chief of staff a guy named Pete Rouse, who had been the chief of staff for Tom Daschle for many, many years. Pete is often referred to as the 101st senator because of his level of respect. And Pete and Phil were good friends, and so Phil recommended me to Pete, and I got the job. And the wonderful part about this entire story is that when I eventually got to the White House in the West Wing, Phil Scalero was the president's head of legislative affairs, so his office was down the hallway from me. Pete Rouse was counselor to the president; his office was downstairs from me. And so it's quite a thing to have two people who have looked over your career for so long, and then have the opportunity to work in the same building with them.
Yeah. Wow. Let's go back a little bit. So working on the oversight committee, we actually had one of the attendees submit a question about if you have a favorite story about Congressman Waxman. You're working there.
Henry Waxman taught me everything I about what it means to be a good legislator. He had been in Congress since 1974, was part of that Watergate, post-Watergate class, and he really was, one of the congressional experts and leading fighters on healthcare and the environment, in addition to oversight. And he was a master legislator who understood all procedures. He had an amazingly dedicated staff of people who had been there 20, 30 years who understood it as well. I'm not sure there's necessarily a story I can tell you about him, but he was kind, he was smart, he was tough as nails. He never gave up, but he also understood the importance of compromise. And he understood, look, if I can get something done, I'm going to get something done. And then next year I'll come back and I'll try to get a little bit more done. And largely because of that approach, the expansion of healthcare, obviously prior to the Affordable Care Act, over the past 20 to 30 years, has Henry Waxman's fingerprints all over that, whether it's Medicaid expansion, whether it's CHIP, and certainly in terms of the Clean Air Act, and other environmental protections. A lot of that are things that he pushed through during his time on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And then obviously when Democrats took the majority in 2006, he became chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee and played a critical role in steering the ACA through Congress.
Yeah, it's amazing because, I worked in Congress for about 3.5 years. And when you see some of the fights that occur Congress to the next Congress, and some of these become recurring until there's sort of a tidal wave where things then move and push forward. It's interesting to hear you talk about that sort of history that a lot of people probably weren't aware of.
And the institutional history matters, and it matters at the staff level as well. I think one of the big advantages that Democratic staffs have over Republican staffs on Capitol Hill is that we don't have term limits for our chairman or ranking members, which means that they're not flipping every 6 years. And so you can build up this incredible institutional memory. So, for instance, this week, obviously, as we think about the Roger Stone commutation, I can draw back on the time when I worked for Henry Waxman in 2001, and the Oversight Committee was looking at Bill Clinton's pardons, last-minute pardons of people like Mark Rich, or whenever whenever we're talking about oversight now, we can refer back to not just Benghazi, but we can refer back to investigations that happened in the Bush 43 administration, ones that happened over the Clinton administration. And it helps because so much of is understanding what the precedent has been. And that really requires institutional memory. And so when you get to work for one of those legislators who has that, as well as a staff, that makes all the difference in the world.
Mm-hmm. And, sort of combining this, so going back again to the 2004, January 2005, there's a new hotshot senator. You get slated to become his legislative director. Now, you've said of that role as the legislative director that it's one of the most fun jobs in the Senate, but it's also an incredible difficult job because you have to know something about any given thing going on in the Senate at the time. It takes a couple years off of your life. What were some of the fun things and what were some of the difficult things about the job?
Well, the first thing is I had never spent a day in the U.S. Senate, so I probably didn't have much business taking on the job as a legislative director. I also didn't have a very deep policy background. I had been an oversight lawyer for the better part of 8 years. But I'm a fast learner. I study really hard. And I remember on one of the first days when I got there, Pete Rouse handed me basically the Senate Procedures Manual, which is this really thick book. And I read the entire thing and I just studied. And I would have C-SPAN on all day long and watch how things were happening. I also hired an incredibly gifted group of staffers, just some of the foremost experts on a variety of subjects. And we, again, when you work for a high profile senator, you attract great talent. And so, I think now about the people that I had a chance to work with back then. Obviously Pete Rouse was our chief of staff. Alyssa Mastromonica, who many people now know from her writings, was our scheduler. Robert Gibbs, who became the White House press secretary, was our communications director. John Favreau was our speech writer. One of our foreign policy advisors was Samantha Power. And so we had an all-star cast of people. So really for me, it was basically helping them understand what the senator's priorities were, helping them understand how to navigate the U.S. Senate, and then just setting them loose. And, it was a fascinating time because you had this new senator who had, all these expectations about him, all this press attention, and there was this desire to see what he could become in the U.S. Senate. And it's challenging because, Peter, he was 99th in seniority in the U.S. Senate. He was in the minority. And so nobody cares that you had given a great convention speech. No one cares that you are, a high-profile senator. When you're in the U.S. Senate, it is seniority bound. And if you show up at a committee hearing, you are the last person to speak because you're the last person on the dais. And so what was challenging is how do you manage those great expectations with both the reality and, frankly, the pace of the U.S. Senate, which is pretty glacial.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting because in law school, they don't teach management. And it seems that what you're talking about is that when you become slated to become legislative director and all of a sudden you have this immensely talented staff that you have to get the best out of them and also, marshal their talents together to help support the then senator. Any sort of insights, what you sort of picked up on in sort of learning how to manage people during that time?
Well, it's funny. I actually went out and bought a copy of Managing for Dummies, which I used to keep on my bookshelf in the office, which I'm sure inspired great confidence among my staff. What it was for me, you can read all kinds of management books, but what I did was I just observed people who I thought were fantastic managers. People like my former staff director, Phil Shalero, people like my current chief of staff, Pete Rouse, and how they did things. And they basically, look, it was a very open, collaborative process where you wanted to hear from everyone in the office, regardless of seniority, regardless of rank. And And you didn't want people disagreeing with each other. You wanted to hear all sides. Look, as the boss or as one of the bosses, you have the final say, but you want those decisions to be based on the smartest people around. It's also important when you manage to manage without any kind of ego. This wasn't about what was good for me. It's about what was good for the senator, what was good about the office. And if we did something great, I would ensure that the staffers got the credit, not me. And I was also just, look, I knew full well I was never going to be a foreign policy expert like Samantha Power. I mean, I was never going to write a speech like Jon Favreau, but there were a lot of other talents that I brought to the table. And so understanding your own talents and where you can maximize that and where you can help get the best out of other people. The analogy I often use is I'm a little bit like, and I've viewed this in all of my subsequent political jobs. I'm like the conductor of a symphony. I may not know how to play every single instrument, but I know how the whole thing's supposed to sound together.
That's a good analogy because, you then go from helping to manage the legislative priorities of the senator and managing the staff there to managing a presidential transition. Could you describe what that was like?
Yeah, there's not a playbook for how to run a presidential transition. And at that point, the last two transitions had been the Gore transition in 2000 and the Kerry transition in 2004. So you can come up with the best plans possible, but it's a little bit like organizing the D-Day invasion. Like, unless your troops actually land on the beach, you don't really know whether the plan works or not. And I was given the task of managing the transition. And I, first of all, everything else, I read everything I could possibly read. I talked to as many people as possible. And then I hired some really, really smart people to help me. And again, did it without any ego, tried to figure out where we needed to be. I started working on the transition in April of 2008. So, we were still slogging away in a primary battle with Senator Clinton. And then we'd have to go through, obviously, a general election campaign against Senator McCain. So I really started working on this project 6 months before Election Day. But I had very clearly had an idea of what we needed, where we needed to be the night before Election Day, because once I knew the day after Election Day, I had a pretty good sense that it's going to be a pretty quick sprint. And look, when you're planning the takeover of the federal government, the biggest, most powerful organization in the world, you can't do it in just the 77 days between Election Day and Inauguration Day. You need to do a lot of planning in advance. And it helped that along this process, I was the executive director. The chairman of the transition was John Podesta, who had served as chief of staff to President Clinton. And nobody or very few people know how government works the way that John does. And in this process, we called on people like Carol Browner, the former EPA administrator, Susan Rice, who obviously became the national security advisor, people like that who just understood how government worked. And so, again, it's just bringing smart people together and, figuring out how to manage them all.
APABA-DC has members from all political stripes, and there's a presidential election upcoming in November. For those thinking about possibly joining an administration as a political appointee, could you describe that process for people?
Yeah, I'd love to say it was merit-based. I'd love to say there's rhyme or reason to it. A lot of it is happenstance. A lot of it is, people who have either served before, people who have come off of Capitol Hill, people who have some connection to somebody. That's not to say that, simply having connections will help you, but understand full well there are a lot of very smart people in the world. There are a lot of people who have subject matter expertise, and it is a little bit of a crapshoot about whether you're able to serve or not. That being said, understand that it is always harder to serve in the first couple of years of administration than certainly years 3 or 4, and if you get to a second term, year 7 or year 8. I would tell anybody who's thinking about doing this, to the extent you have any time right now, make sure your financial records are in shape. Make sure you don't owe any money in your taxes. Make sure that you've certainly been, up to speed and paying, all the taxes on your nannies and your gardeners and all those things. To the extent that you've given public remarks, get copies of them. Start pulling all that stuff because it'll all be vetted. You're going to have to go through a FBI security clearance process. You have to go through a White House security clearance process. That's even before you get considered for a specific job. And obviously, to the extent that you're able to volunteer on a campaign, whether it's giving money, whether it's just simply, who knows whether we're door knocking in an age of COVID, but to the extent you're able to give some assistance, that helps. And then just be attuned to people who are getting jobs, because if you've been in kind of political circles for a while, you'll know a lot of people. And oftentimes the best way to find out about job opportunities is through somebody who's already gotten a job.
Mm. Mm. You, during that time, during the transition, and then you started off as the cabinet secretary. Could you describe for people what the cabinet secretary does and what your sort of objectives were at that time?
Yeah, look, I did not even know this was a job that existed. I went to go see Rahm Emanuel, who was going to be our incoming chief of staff, a couple weeks after Election Day 2008. And I was told to prepare a list of jobs that I wanted. And this was not on my list. I didn't know it existed. He basically told me this was my job. And when Rahm Emanuel tells you you're taking a job, you basically take the job. And so I was essentially the liaison between the president and his cabinet. And Rahm's dictates to us were no surprises. He never wanted to be surprised by something that was happening in the agencies, and he never wanted the agencies to be surprised by something that's happening in the White House. And so we are essentially kind of the traffic cop, the air traffic controller, that's sort of managing every single thing happening in the agencies, from policy announcements to speeches to funding announcements to regs to everything, whatever. And then making sure they sync up with what the White House is doing on any given day and every given week, and to make sure that they're not conflicting with each other. So it literally is like being an air traffic controller and watching just planes flying around and making sure nothing crashes into anything else. And so there's a policy coordination aspect to it. There's a communications aspect. And frankly, it's just a big interpersonal job where you are managing really big egos. People who are, former governors, former senators, who are not used to, taking instructions from anybody, nor should they. But helping them understand that, here's how your part fits in with a broader vision of the White House. Here's why you need to move faster on this. Here's why you really can't do this today. And so it was a heck of an opportunity, but it was a pretty hard 4 years.
Yeah.
But that being said, one of the proudest things is we ran one of the most stable cabinets in the first 4 terms, one of the most effective, no scandals, no one went to jail, no one had to resign in disgrace, and we did. It was a fantastic group of people, and many of the cabinet members from that first term are just still some of my closest friends.
Wow. Fast forward then to 2014, when you become unanimously confirmed as the Deputy Secretary of Labor, becoming the first Asian American to hold the position and only the second Asian American in history to serve as the Deputy Secretary of a cabinet department. Could you describe that job and sort of what you sought to accomplish when you first swore the oath and got your computer and sat down in your office?
So I should also just back up a little bit. After President Obama got reelected in 2012, he sat down with each member of the senior staff, and I basically told him, I've enjoyed serving you. I've been with him for 8 years at this point.
Yeah.
But I'm just tired. I just need a break. And I'm not done serving forever, but I'm done for now. And which is hard because, you sort of imagine like, God, you get to the pinnacle of your career and you've got an office in the West Wing and you just kind of walk away from it. But I just needed a break. And I didn't think I was really as effective as I could have been. And so I left right after the president was inaugurated again in February. And I basically walked away without a job, without any idea of what I was going to do. And I had this amazing gap year where I taught at several universities. I co-edited a book. I gave speeches. I did consulting. It was great. And I had always told the president that, look, if there's something you want me to do, I'll happily come back and do that. And so a couple months after I had left, I got a call from the White House personnel office saying, we'd love to, would you like to be a deputy secretary? And I said, sure, it sounds like a great job. And I had worked with a lot of deputy secretaries, so I knew what the job was. And they said, well, would you like to be the deputy secretary of labor? And I said, I don't know anything about labor issues. And they said, look, that's fine. Go sit down and talk to the person who we're going to nominate for the secretary. And that was Tom Perez. And Tom and I just hit it off. I mean, we knew each other a little bit, but we just hit it off. And Tom didn't care that I didn't know anything about labor issues. Tom had been the Secretary of Labor in Maryland. He had been the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. And he knew everything about this. He knew I knew how government worked. He knew I knew how the White House worked. He knew that I had a reputation as a good manager, and that's what he wanted. Yeah. And so I got nominated to be the Deputy Secretary of Labor. Stipulate, don't know anything about labor, and just studied harder than I've studied for anything, like multiple times harder than I ever studied for the bar exam. And, God help you, anyone who has to go through a Senate confirmation hearing, but made it through my Senate confirmation hearing without any problems and got confirmed unanimously. And so, again, it's sort of the same, whether it was going to the Senate, whether going to the White House. I took the role because it was a great management role. Yeah. And it was a chance to work with good people like Tom Perez, a good chance to learn something new. And I came in, eyes wide open that I didn't know everything, but I fully understood that nobody was going to outwork me. And so I just studied. I crammed for my Senate confirmation. I read the entire budget of the department. I subsequently never read, even though I was in charge of the budget, read every GAO report, every CRS report. I just read everything there was to read about the Department of Labor. And then began this amazing 3-year journey as Tom Perez's deputy during the second term.
And so that role as deputy is often described as being the chief operating officer. What kind of insights did you gain running a huge bureaucracy and workforce of over 17,000 people?
Yeah, it's kind of a crazy job in the sense that the secretary is really the outward-facing person, is doing a lot of the public events. The deputy is the one who's keeping trains running on time. So I oversaw budgets, personnel, IT, facilities, policy, regs, basically just the workings of the department. What I learned is I grew up, my dad was a federal career civil servant. I come from many aunts and uncles who worked in the federal government. I have the utmost respect for career officials, and it gave me a much deeper respect for the hard job that they do and the important job that they do. And so my job was really to help them understand what not just the president's priorities were, but what Secretary Perez's priorities were, helping execute on these. And one of the biggest initiatives we took internally was to raise employee engagement within the Department of Labor. There is a survey every year done of agencies on employee engagement. And among the 18 large federal agencies, the Department of Labor, when Tom and I got there, was number 17 out of 18. I mean, we're the Department of Labor, of workers, and we were second to last. By the time Tom and I left in 2017, we had moved all the way to number 6. And so, our theory of the case was you can get a lot more done with more people, more budgets, but you can get a lot more done if people feel engaged in what they are doing. And so that was an important part of how we could help push the president's agenda, by having a workforce that was more invested in the outcomes.
Yeah. It's interesting you talking about sort of productivity and also your experience as cabinet secretary about this vast, bureaucracy that you're running. And I recently listened to a podcast featuring Michael Lewis, the author of The Big Short, The Blind Side, where he was talking about specifically with COVID-19 and the pandemic, that something that even with the immense amount of sheer talent in America, arguably the most in the entire world, and yet the United States has fundamentally failed on so many levels in dealing with the pandemic from a good government perspective. And I know we talk about politics, messaging, and the like, but what do you think are qualities that are needed in personnel for quote unquote good government to help individuals and families and businesses thrive and grow?
I mean, look, in the first term when I helped manage President Obama's cabinet, we dealt with H1N1 in 2009. We dealt with Deepwater Horizon in 2010. We had hurricanes. We had tornadoes. We had wildfires. We obviously had Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and then Ebola by 2014, and then Zika after that. We had our share of crises as well. Oh, yeah, we had a global recession that we were dealing with. You know what? But what helped was a couple things. I think stability and competence matters. I always tell people this, like, in terms of Homeland Security, for the first 4 years of the Obama administration, we had the same Homeland Security advisor, Homeland Security secretary, same FEMA administrator. And the three of them were all people who had spent years in government, understood how government worked, and then understood how all of them worked together. And look, it takes a long time to understand how government works, but the longer you do it, the better you get at it. And in the Obama administration, we didn't always get every crisis right, but we learned from the mistakes we had made and then tried to improve the next time. We also constantly drilled. Every 3 to 6 months, we would do tabletop exercises with the entire senior White House staff as well as the cabinet, and we would play act nuclear attack, cyber attack, power grid failures, and we would all have to anticipate what we had done along the way. I also had the task on State of the Union night to pick the designated survivor, so the person who would sit out the speech. So I understood full well what would happen if there were a catastrophic attack and how government continues after that. And that's the problem with where we are right now, is that you've got a constant turnover among White House staff, cabinet staff. I would say it also matters that you rely on scientists, you rely on experts along the way. I mean, again, I will be partisan. I mean, when I see the attacks on people like Dr. Fauci, who was instrumental in helping us back in the Obama administration on H1N1 and Ebola, I think that's crazy. Like, when you're in a national crisis, you want an all hands on deck approach. You don't want to sideline anybody, and you especially don't want to sideline people who are going to disagree with you, because you need to hear all perspectives.
Did you personally get to know Dr. Fauci back when you were in the White House or otherwise?
No, but I was in, I'm sure, and I've went back and looked, I was in multiple tabletop exercises. And in fact, I mean, it's been written about. Oh, okay, I'm just going to. A week before Inauguration Day, January 2017, we had a tabletop exercise of the outgoing Obama administration with the incoming Trump administration. And we play acted 3 scenarios that we thought were the most likely scenarios that they would face. One is a hurricane, one is a cyber attack, and one was a pandemic. And we walked through what happens in a pandemic, and we had come up with a playbook of how to deal with the pandemic, and we had handed it to them. And these are things that really smart people in government spend their lives thinking about, and you want to rely on those people when you get to that situation.
Speaking about the pandemic, I want to pivot a little bit. The pandemic has also seen a spike in anti-Asian hate crimes and hate incidents. APABA-DC has written to the mayor about this. We also issued a statement joined by numerous other organizations who allied with us regarding this swelling of hateful acts directed towards AAPIs. What role do you think the government should play in addressing anti-Asian acts of violence and acts of hate? And any other sort of thoughts that you've observed or have thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, there's a group called Stop Hate that has been tracking these incidents, and since mid-March, there have been 2,100 documented incidents of anti-Asian harassment or attacks. Look, tone comes from the top, and words matter, and when words especially matter when they come from the president. And when you call something the Chinese virus, when you call it the Kung flu, there are going to be consequences to that. Look, I am just appalled when I read articles like the one in the Washington Post a couple weeks ago about Asian American doctors and nurses being harassed by their own patients, intimating that they somehow had something to do with the virus. Or, when I hear and I dread what is going to happen when school kids go back to school and they're accused of spreading the virus. Look, the tone from the top matters, and to have and the words that are coming out of this president's mouth should not be coming out of his mouth. Look, we can have a whole conversation about what China's role in this is, but we need to very clearly delineate between China and Chinese Americans or Asian Americans here in this country. And so, look, I've been outspoken about this issue on TV and social media, and I applaud everyone who is fighting for this. I know that there's going to be a lot more work done in the next couple of months to highlight this.
Yeah, I was recently listening to an audio clip of Fred Korematsu, who's the Asian American civil rights activist who in 1942, after President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which led to Japanese internment and the removal from the West Coast and him refusing to comply. And many years after his internment, he said these words, and I quote, "In those days, if you're an Asian, people automatically think you don't belong in this country. You're not an American." And I thought that was wrong. And it was chilling for me to listen to the audio recording, because here we are nearly 80 years later, and so many Asians in America are experiencing the same kind of hostile contempt. I'm curious, just as a visible Asian American yourself, have there been instances of anti-Asian bias that you've experienced, and even throughout your career as you've been coming up through the ranks?
Look, I'm fortunate to have worked for a senator and president who valued diversity around his table, and who understood that if you wanted to govern the best, you needed a leadership team that looked like America. And so, I only have the highest words of compliment for President Obama. But look, when I've been, when I was the deputy secretary of the Department of Labor, at that point, only one other department had ever had a deputy secretary running, an Asian American deputy secretary. So I fully understood that there were a lot of people who had never seen somebody like me running their department. But, I worked very hard to gain their trust. I worked very hard to show that I was going to produce results to them. And so they treated me as they would have treated a Caucasian or an African American or Latino. But boy, I got to tell you, social media is a pretty ugly place. And if you engage the way I engage on TV and social media, you get your fair share of vitriol sent back, and a lot of it is horribly, horribly racist. I do screenshot all of it because I periodically like to look at it. Paul's my wife, but it reminds you again, and I say this to anyone on this call, like, it doesn't matter how you've succeeded or where you've gone to school or how much money you have. There's a segment of people in this country who will judge you solely by the way you look. And I think it's important, as we are in this moment of Black Lives Matter, to understand how much more we have in common with other people of color than how much we have different from them.
It's interesting you mentioned that basically how the country was absolutely stunned when video footage of first Ahmaud Arbery's murder was released in Georgia, and then the Memorial Day videos that showed both the Christian Cooper incident in Central Park about the false police report and the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. It unleashed so much pain and anger and frustration and months of protests that are still ongoing. What, from your vantage, having worked in government so long, and again, working for the first African-American president, can you describe how you reacted when you saw that, and sort of your observations from the last few months?
Look, none of this surprises me. I mean, there has been mistreatment of people of color, systemic mistreatment since the time this country was founded, and obviously before then. The difference we have right now is that people are armed with a cell phone camera, and so there's a greater there's a greater awareness of that, and I think that's a good thing. But so none of this necessarily surprises me, but it's appalling, and I think, again, and we could stipulate this is a small percentage of police officers who are doing this. It's a very, very small percentage, but it's still important. But I think beyond this, we also need to consider, particularly in this time of the pandemic, the broader systemic racial inequalities that we have in this country right now. That the black-white wealth gap has widened over the last 40 or 50 years. It's the education gap, it's the healthcare gap we have in this country right now, that we have essential workers in this country who are largely people of color, who are the lowest paid people, who are putting themselves at the greatest risk. And yes, we need to focus on police reform, and it's critically important, but we also need to understand that beneath them, there's a much broader set of systemic inequalities that we need to address as well.
On this topic, APABA-DC, we issued a statement denouncing racial injustice. And as an organization, we've been grappling with and trying to figure out just exactly what our role should be in this moment. A lot of our members, the majority of whom are lawyers within law firms, have been thinking hard about doing something that is meaningful, effective, and will help sort of advance the ball on this. Do you have any sort of thoughts or recommendations for those types of members in our community?
Look, obviously supporting the groups that are active in this area is important. Every company, organization in this country has issued a statement. That's great, it's fine, but that doesn't move the needle as much as it does in terms of, first of all, examine your own organization's policies. I mean, we see this, in the Asian American community. Look at the number of Asian American law students, the number of Asian American associates of law firms, then you start to get higher and higher up. The relatively small number of Asian American partners at major law firms around the country. Look at companies, look at boards of directors, and then you can, and as bad as it is for Asian Americans, it's worse for Latinos, for African Americans. I mean, corporate America has not been, look, we can criticize, corporate America can criticize a lot of other people, but corporate America needs to look at itself as to what changes they can make. I mean, simply just pull up, the publicly traded, the boards of directors of many publicly traded companies. You're going to see an incredible similarity in how all of those people look.
And related to this, this is a question from an attendee. Despite Asian Americans being the fastest growing group in the nation, what needs to change as far as political power for the Asian American community so that API leaders have a voice at the table on issues that significantly impact our communities, such as on healthcare, on immigration, and the like?
First of all, our community doesn't register to vote in the same numbers as other people, other groups. And when we do register to vote, we don't vote in the same percentage. So obviously registering to vote and voting is especially important. And so to the extent that people can help people in our community, especially those that, might be recent immigrants and have language barriers in terms of registering and voting, that's all critically important. Giving money to candidates is also critically important. Our community is not known as particularly giving a generous community when it comes to fundraising and donations. And I think as much as important, I think, encouraging people to run for office. The truth is right now, even at, however many percentage of people we have in this country right now, 5-6% of this country, there are going to be relatively few places in this country where you're going to have a majority Asian American voting demographic. So and to the extent that there are those, by and large, we've kind of already won all of those seats. So it's really going to have to be Asian Americans running in district states that are not majority Asian American. And I think that, that takes a special kind of skill to do that. But yet you've seen it. You look at remarkable people like, Tammy Duckworth right now, who's representing the state of Illinois, and you see other powerful members of Congress. I think about somebody like Andy Kim, who's in South Jersey, Congressman Andy Kim. I mean, these people are representing far more majority white districts at this point because they're very gifted politicians. These are also people who have worked their way up through political and government jobs along the way. And I think it's creating a pipeline of talent on Capitol Hill, in the federal government, in nonprofits, in local political organizations as well. And then once we get at the seat at the table, and once we kind of climb the ladder, lending a hand to the next person who's climbing up behind you.
Mm. This reference to a pipeline, I'm curious, for those, for example, who may be listening, who are perhaps thinking about running for office someday, what kind of advice would you give them?
Look, first of all, get involved in your community. And getting involved in your community could be, serving on the local PTA, being on your condo board. People want to know that you're not just in it for yourself and that you have a history of working on behalf of others. You have to get used to asking people for money. My old boss, Phil Shalero, the advice he gave me back in the early 2000s, so now take this as 15, 20-year-old inflation that you need to do. He said, before you run for office, you need to you need to be able to come up with a list of 400 people who you can ask to give you $1,000. Now, in this day and age, $400,000 is not going to get you anywhere in a congressional race. So multiply the amounts and the number of people. But you have to get used to asking people for money, asking for their vote. It's a very, very hard skill to learn how to do. And then understand why you're doing it and what you hope to get out of it and why the people, like, if you can't explain in a 2 or 3 sentences why you're running and what you will do, then you probably shouldn't do it at all. So, but I encourage anyone who, look, I'll tell you, I've never put my name on a ballot, so I have great respect for anyone who does do it.
Would you ever want to break some news here? Or?
I never say never. If the right position were to open up, I would consider running. And I kind of never thought I would. But I think there's a desire. It would be, again, I'm always looking for new challenges in my career, and that would kind of be the next challenge, I think.
We have an audience attendee question, and the question has to do with if there is either a new presidential administration or even this administration, how can organizations like APABA-DC or the national organization, which I should have mentioned at the outset, they are also sponsoring this event, NAPABA. How can those types of organizations help their members in the presidential appointment process? And if you want to speak to that.
I think there's value in putting together slates of names. And I think in particular, looking for names that people who are outside the Beltway. We all know, like any of us who have been in political circles can name that, 10, 20 people here in DC who would be good at some of these jobs. But tell me somebody in LA and New York and, other cities that I wouldn't even think about. Tell me people who are doing amazing things in their community, who are serving at state and local government, or who are running, law firms or running companies who would be good. So I think, first of all, looking for not the usual suspects would be useful. I think also for those people who are thinking about government, I say this to you affectionately, all of you as lawyers. Don't just assume you can only do a lawyer job in government. Yes, there are general counsels at every agency. There are deputy general counsels. But those jobs are relatively few compared to all of the other policy and management jobs. And, both on my White House staff and on my Department of Labor staff, I prioritized hiring lawyers to do policy jobs because they were smart, they worked hard, they were detail-oriented, and they could see around corners. And those kinds of qualities that it takes to be a good lawyer make you very good at a lot of other jobs.
Speaking about sort of folks who have a law degree and pivoting to non-law jobs or taking somewhat of an unconventional approach, what was sort of your thought process when you, for example, you start off as a litigation associate, then you're doing oversight work, which is, been in Congress, and you're doing some investigatory legal type work. Did you ever how did that transition come about? And were you ever thinking, oh no, I'm losing my legal street cred here? Or was it an intentional, directional push from yourself to say, no, I want to get into management or I want to get into policy?
I got to tell you, I'm very happy to lose my legal street cred. I mean, it is one of the ironies when you are, when I was the Deputy Secretary of Labor, I did nominally oversee, we don't have a general counsel, we have a solicitor. I nominally oversee our solicitor. And I wouldn't even try to I didn't even try to pretend I had a legal hat on at all. I mean, it's sort of laughable that I was saying that I said to you at the outset, I still pay my bar dues every year. And it's really mostly because I invested so much money into legal education. It seems like a waste not to be an active member, although I got to tell you, I have no idea why I still pay him. Yeah, I was perfectly happy to lose my legal street cred. So it was actually more important, how do you gain the policy creds? Because there's nothing in law school, at least when I went, that taught you how the legislative process works. It was all judge-made law. And so, look, when I was on the House Oversight Committee, I was doing investigations, and it was a natural transition from being a litigation associate. And the reason I got that job was because I knew how to take a deposition. I take them in private practice, and I was going to take them on the Hill. But I really want to be a policy person. And the House Oversight Committee has virtually no or relatively little legislative authority, except in a couple of small areas. One of them is the Federal Civil Service. And one day, my staff director, Phil Shaliro, came to me and said, we need somebody to staff Federal Civil Service issues. Would you be willing to do that? Because he knew I wanted to do policy work. And I jumped at it. It's not the sexiest issue in the world, although I will tell all of you it's a fascinating area to know something about. And it didn't matter like that it wasn't, national security or environmental or healthcare, because the process of drafting a bill relating to civil service is the same as drafting anything else, or the process of how you move it through committee. And this is back in the day when we actually had regular order and we passed legislation, and I even went to conference committees several times, which never happens anymore. How you debate it on the floor, that all matters. It's all process. And so starting with that little sliver of federal civil service as the policy area, I then learned the process, and I was then able to pick up other things. So these are your opportunities to get into the area you want to get into.
So it's interesting because in a lot of your storytelling, I'm hearing a lot is people asking you about a particular opportunity, and you saying yes. You saying, yeah, sure, I don't know anything about labor, but yes, this is something I'm looking for, and I will study my tail off. For a lot of women and people of color, there are studies done, and there's been a lot written about experiencing self-doubt, and in particular what's called the imposter syndrome, or some have referred to it. Justice Sotomayor writes about it prominently in her own autobiography. Have you ever grappled with imposter syndrome-ish, or whatever you want to call it? And what are some ways in which you were able to get through it?
So I always tell people this: take risks with your career. Don't take stupid risks. I mean, like, if somebody offers me Dr. Fauci's job, I'm going to say, no, I'm not qualified to be Dr. Fauci. But in a lot of the other jobs I've taken, it is a natural extension from something I have done in the past. And I can see something in my previous experience or some skill set I have that meshes up with the next role. Running a Senate office is not that dissimilar from running the cabinet, which is running the transition to running a federal department. Things just got bigger and bigger along the way. And the challenges became more, the budgets got bigger, the number of people got bigger, but the same management challenges. Like, I have fired people throughout my career, and I've actually gotten pretty good at firing people. And that's just like but it's not a skill I'm proud of, but I actually can fire people pretty well. But I'm saying that, like, some of the same things you've had to do during your different time, telling no to your boss, managing difficult staff, coming up with priorities, making people feel included, collaborating. These are all things that you just learn along the way. I'll give you an example of imposter syndrome, or a place where I had to push back against this. So when you're the deputy secretary you're largely the person behind the scenes. I did do a fair amount of traveling, but nobody, when the deputy secretary shows up in town, it's not like the secretary shows up in town. You don't get great press. Um, the one time when the Secretary of Labor gets a lot of press is the when the jobs numbers come out. The first Friday of every month they come out. And back in the Obama administration, the Secretary of Labor would do, I mean, back-to-back TV, radio, print interviews for the entire day. And when I got there, I had no expectation that I would ever do that. I really had not done a lot of press in my life. And I didn't even know if I should go to the prep sessions where Tom Perez prepped for all his press. But I thought, you know what? I should go. This is like being Tom Brady's backup. You may never get a chance to play, but God help you if he gets injured and you get thrown into a game. You better be ready. So I went for about 7 or 8 months just watching him prep and sort of working through myself how I would do it. And then one day, 8 or 9 months in, he said, hey, I got to travel on jobs day. Do you want to do the press? I could have said, not ready. Don't ask me. Let's not do it. I said, sure. I didn't know if I'd be good. I didn't know if I would like it. And I did, as everything else, I had watched him do it. I had studied myself and I did it. And I actually kind of liked it. And it kind of, I did. And then as 2016 rolled around and Tom was doing a lot of surrogate work for Hillary Clinton, I did it like 3 or 4 months in a row. And I had a lot of fun. And I remember, I didn't know if how do I do something with this TV commentary thing? And I remember the day before Inauguration Day, January 2017, all the political appointees had got kicked out of the Labor Department. So we were out having drinks, celebratory drinks or commiserating or whatever it was. And I got a phone call on my cell phone saying, from the producer of Rachel Maddow's show, saying, hey, we're doing a segment on presidential transitions and how Trump's did. Do you want to come on and do my show tonight? I said, sure. And I did Rachel Maddow's show January 19th, 2017. And that kind of kicked off a pretty fruitful TV and radio commentary career right now.
Yeah. Wow. We'll wind down shortly, but one of the other questions I wanted to ask you was, I had never heard that story before about the possibility of you being a job candidate as the legislative director for Hillary Clinton while she was in the Senate. And I love to ask people this, sort of, when you look back at your career thus far, what are kind of the big what if moments that you look to? Like, what if in your professional life that you reflect upon sometimes, such as, what if I had in fact been asked to become Senator Clinton's legislative director, and I said yes before Phil had told me, hey, there's this other new senator who's coming to town. Any sort of big what ifs in your career that you look at, and when you think about how when you zig this way instead of zag that way?
The funny thing about this, Peter, and I'm pretty open about that, I didn't get the Clinton job. And so I got to a fork in the road. One fork was closed, so I took the other fork. Now, look, because I actually knew Barack Obama, I suspected if I'd gotten both jobs, I would have gone the Obama route anyway. But if I think about, like, if I'd gotten the Clinton job, the forks diverged and they would have come right back together. I mean, it's, look, I've never really had a 5-year career path. I've never had a 1-year career path. I literally don't know what I'm doing 6 months from now, 3 months from now, and I'm actually okay with that. I'm always looking for interesting experiences to work with good people. I've based most of my career trajectory on not caring about money very much at all, which has worked out great because you have interesting experiences along the way. And I always tell people, like, look, if you want a straight linear career, go live your grandparents' generation and work at IBM, work at General Motors, because you'll know what you'll be doing 20 years in, 30 years, 40 years. That's not the kind of careers any of us are going to have. We're going to have 10, 15, 20 different jobs along the way. Some of them will be really good. Some of them won't be really good. If they're not good, you move on to something else and you learn from that experience. And maybe when you look back on your career, you can't necessarily draw a straight line through everything. Or maybe it's a zigzag, or maybe it's just a lot of dots. all over the place, of different job experiences, and I'm actually okay with that. So I've never been one who sort of regretted decisions I've made along the way. I'm always kind of looking forward to what that next interesting challenge might be.
Yeah. Sort of my last kind of question, given the various leadership roles you've had, managing huge organizations, managing, a Senate office, and in talking about diversity and inclusion in particular, and I know you touched on this a little bit, but what were some of the sort of key performance indices, or what were whenever you're at the top and you're looking at data to see, to track how you're doing, what progress you're making on diversity and inclusion, for example, in a legislative office, wherever you are, what were some of the things that you looked for in trying to improve in those areas?
Yeah, so when I was the Deputy Secretary of Labor, I also co-chaired the federal government's diversity and inclusion initiative. So I have a pretty good sense of what this is like government-wide. First of all, you have to make sure that you have a broad pipeline. And again, let's stipulate, when we talk about diversity, we're not just talking about racial diversity, gender diversity, sexual orientation, gender identity. We're talking about people who come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, people who have different work experiences as well. So the entire gamut of diversity. So you need to make sure you have a big pipeline. And part of it is examining, where are you recruiting for people? If you're going to the same, when I was the Deputy Secretary of Labor, I used to say to tech companies, look, if you are, if you're looking for coders who have come out of a coding class that requires a 12-week commitment and $20,000 of tuition, you're going to get coders that look kind of pretty similar. But if you go and hire coders who come out of a community college, they're going to look a lot different than that. So you have to look at how big your pipeline is and where you're recruiting. And then you need to track not only where people are, but their development along the way. Because inevitably in organizations, as we just mentioned, whether it's a law firm or a corporation, when you get to the senior management ranks, the diversity just disappears. And why does it disappear? So then you need to go through different parts of the process and figure out what is broken. Is there not enough mentoring? Is there not enough professional development? Is there a hostile work environment that is not conducive? Are there pay inequities along the way? Are there issues in terms of work-life balance? I mean, one of the things I pushed at the Department of Labor is more telework policies, because I understood that there were moms with childcare obligations who would rather work 4 days a week than 5, or who could do their work in off hours. And I thought that was a great thing. If you got your work done and we had a way to evaluate people objectively, I didn't care where or when you got it done. Because I wanted to be conscious of, because I know what it's like when I look at the data in terms of the labor force participation of women in this country and how it drops off, when they become of childbearing age. And so I wanted to sort of look at that across the board. And then you need to push your senior leaders to embrace diversity as well. We made each of our assistant secretaries have an engagement, a diversity plan, and we held their feet to the fire, and that was part of their evaluations as well. So it really needs to be a top-down commitment. There's not one easy solution to it.
Mm. Well, that is really, we're here at the conclusion of our program here. I want to leave the floor open. If you wanted to mention anything on behalf of the community, would love to hear sort of what you think is upcoming for yourself, and again, express my deepest thanks for you participating in this.
Well, I wish I had something to tell you about what I'm going to do 3 months from now. I genuinely don't, and I'm not being coy. Peter, first of all, thank you for the thoughtful questions and for inviting me. I would just say to all of you who are listening, who are law students or lawyers, in this moment in our country history, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to look beyond ourselves to our broader communities. And look, it doesn't have to be giving up your existing career to go into public service, but what can you do each day, each week, to help your community, your broader country, whatever it is? It's about looking beyond yourself. And so I hope each of you can sort of think about that. And I'm a big believer in kind of small actions collectively can make a big difference.
Thanks so much, Chris. And finally, just to close, thank you to APABA-DC, and thank you to NAPABA, which also co-sponsored this event. Please look out for our weekly newsletter and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks.
Thank you.